independent variable is the fixed. It's the fixed or the constant. It's the fixed or the constant. Okay. Now, when I first go over this, it might seem a little confusing at first, but give it a little bit of a chance. You'll find that it's actually pretty easy. This isn't really anything but adding one new thing on top of what you've learned. I need you to put your head up, please. It can be represented by the x coordinate. So the x value is always going to be the independent variable. So we now just have a new fancy name for independent variable. It's sometimes called the control. I won't call it control, but you might see that in science. Like your control group would be your x. Something that is very important that I want you to know is time is always independent. Okay? Alright, let's talk about the dependent variable. It is responsive. It responds. I misspelled it, so it's good you can't see it. Responsive. It's basically dependent on the other things that are happening. It's always represented by the y, so the y value or the y coordinate, and it changes. One important one that is always dependent is total cost. Okay? So just so I remember it, pretty easy, I'm going to put an x out here and a y out here so I can see that pretty easy. Alright, so sometimes we're going to see some scenarios that we need to figure out the independent and dependent. Sometimes we'll see a graph and sometimes we'll see tables. So let's start with our scenarios. Alright, so let me say the whole scenario before you respond. Alright, it says Jameson runs M miles and burns C number of calories. So we have miles and calories. Okay, so listen to both ways. Is the number of miles dependent on how many calories are burned, or is the number of calories burned dependent on how many miles I run? Yes. That's right. So the calories are dependent on how many miles I run. Okay. So if I ran 2 miles, I would burn, say, 200 calories. If I ran 4 miles, that would change how many calories I burned. Alright, let's try another one. The more hours Brady practices, the better his test grade will be. So we have two things. We have hours and grade. So listen to the whole thing before you respond. Is how many hours he practices dependent on his test grade? Or is his test grade dependent on how many hours? Christian?
The hours, no, the test grade is dependent on the hours.
So the grade is the dependent variable, and so the hours is the independent. Now remember what I said a minute ago. Time is always the independent, which is the x. So there's a time. Okay? Let's do the one below it. Preston, I hope you understand. It's not a race so much as I want to try and see that everybody's understanding. I need you to put your head up, please. Okay, a car travels 60 miles per hour. So what I'm going to have here is I'm going to basically have 60 miles in 1 hour. So the question is the miles driven dependent on how many hours, or is how many hours is dependent on the miles driven? Travis? That's okay. Sometimes I'll lose it right away too. Reese, you want to help him out? Right, so the miles are dependent and the hours, there's our time again, is the independent. Remember, time is always going to be your independent. Let's slide back over to 3. Michael pays $8.99 per month for his Netflix subscription. So think about it. Is his number of months dependent on how much he pays, or is how much he pays dependent on how many months? Travis? Right, and it's dependent on the months. Alright. So just to remind you, this is time. Months is a measurement of time, so that's independent. And then also up here it says total cost will always be dependent. So this is the cost. Good job. Alright, number 5. Each bag of popcorn costs $6 at the football game. So what do you think on this one is the dependent? Paul?
The total cost.
That's right. Cost is always our dependent. So that leaves what for the independent, Paul? Do you know?
Yeah, that's how many bags of popcorn.
Perfect. Bags of popcorn. Okay, so the bags of popcorn is going to be the independent. And the last one here, the later Jessie stays up at night, the sleepier she is at school. Is how late she stays up dependent on how sleepy she is, or is how sleepy she is dependent on how late she stays up? Preston?
How sleepy she is depends on the
So-
staying up. Like, is that like she gets what she needs.
Right, because again, time is always independent. Good job. So, to me, these are rather tricky. Y'all did really, really good on them. Right here, write tables and graphs. Tables and graphs can also display independent and dependent variables. Now, on the front side, we said, I'm going to flip it over real quick. On the front side, we said that X is the independent and Y is dependent. So that means that we also have our x-axis here, so this is our independent. That's our independent variable. And we have a y-axis, so that means that this is our dependent. Okay? So question number 1 says, what is the independent variable? So let's look. We have Paul's weight loss. It says number of weeks. So this is our independent. So let's look at weeks. Not that Paul. Paul from like 10 years ago.
This is 2017.
I know. All right, Paul from 2 years ago. All right. All right, and what is the dependent variable? So over here it says my dependent variable is what? Pounds. Pounds lost. So I'm going to say LB as lost. Okay, so that would be the dependent variable. What is the independent quantities? Now, when they ask for quantities, they're asking for the numbers. And so what are some of the independent numbers, Corey? What are some of the independent numbers down here? There's a little bit of chatter. Can we settle down? So I'm looking for numbers that are under my independent quantities.
Like one.
Right.
Like do I list all the numbers?
That's a good question. I'm not needing you to list them all. So you would write out a couple examples. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Maybe somebody else picked to do 2, 4, and 6. That's okay too. And then what are some dependent? Morgan, what are some dependent quantities? 3, 6, 9, 12. Okay, and so that's not hard. So our graph is actually pretty easy. We just remember our x-axis is the independent and our y-axis is dependent. Oh, good grief. All right, we're going to be on the tables now. The tables are pretty easy because if you remember back, our tables, the left side is always the x and the y is always on the right. And we said the x values are independent and the y values are dependent. So what is the independent variable on this one? Preston?
One. Yeah.
The independent variable is the x value, which is on this side. So it's the pounds, P. And then what is the dependent variable? W. Pretty simple. What's the independent?
H.
What's the dependent?
M.
What's the independent? What's the dependent?
D.
Alright, now down here, they're asking us to write some of the quantities of the independent. So what are some quantities? There you go, 3, 6, 9. And then you don't have to list them all. You can just list a couple of them. What are some of the dependent?
165, 495, and 660.
Perfect. Write that down. Fill in 9 and 10. And then I need you to get on It's Learning.